So let's start. Thank you, David. Thank you very much for your visit. Our first question is rather personal. Could you tell us something new and previously unknown about when and how did you realize that enigma of consciousness? How did you come to the hard problem? Something new and previously unknown, because
unknown to me.
Unknown to the wide public. To the wide public.
Yeah, the problem of consciousness for me, somehow it was always there since a young age. Maybe because I was quite quickly inducted into the materialist way of thinking, where one could explain everything physically. But consciousness was still a striking fact. I was always focused on colors and space, and I think, how could all this be something in my brain? But I started getting more serious about it perhaps when, well, I did one course at university on philosophy. I didn't do so well. I got the worst grade of my undergraduate record for philosophy, but it got me thinking about this systematically. When I was on my way to Oxford to do a graduate degree in mathematics, I actually spent about 6 months hitchhiking around Europe. And there's a lot of time by the side of a road, waiting for cars to come. I brought some books with me, and there were many philosophical books, not analytic philosophy. At this point, I didn't know anything about analytic philosophy, but books like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and the Tao Te Ching, Hermann Hesse, the Glass Bead Game, Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose. And somehow all these philosophical books got me very focused on thinking about philosophy and thinking somehow especially about consciousness. I got soon to Oxford and I thought I'll be thinking about mathematics. But then I just became obsessed by the problem of consciousness. And what actually obsessed me the most was the fact that we talk about consciousness. That I am here saying things to you, like I'm conscious. I find consciousness a mystery. And all this talk is somehow being produced by my brain. And there seems to be no explanatory gap, especially between my brain and the talking. But there's this giant explanatory gap between my brain and the consciousness. And it seemed to me that somehow these two facts had to be reconciled. And I thought maybe this would be the key to the hard problem of consciousness, reconciling these facts. So in this time at Oxford, I just spent all my time thinking about this problem. And I thought eventually I'd go back to mathematics, but I never did. This obsession with the problem of consciousness took over, and it's a long story. But in the end, it seemed to me this is the single most exciting problem in the world. And this is the thing I want to spend my time trying to understand. I don't know if that's new and previously unknown enough for you.
Thank you. At that time, you didn't use the term hard problem, of course, but late you explained and defined the hard problem rather differently. Why is it so? And which of the statements, numerous statements of the hard problem is the best one, if it is legitimate to ask such a question, of course?
Yeah, I actually don't know when I first started using the phrase, the hard problem. I suppose I should go back through all my records and all my emails. In my PhD thesis, which was written in '93, I think I talk about the hard part of the mind-body problem or something like this. I do remember, though, that in the seminar I taught with students at Washington University in '93 and '94, I was using this phrase. Because they asked me that. I saw the advertisement for this Tucson Consciousness Conference, and I said, I'm going to go and I think I'll submit a paper to present at this conference. And they said, I remember one of them saying to me, so what are you going to talk about? Easy problems, hard problems? And I said, yeah, I'll talk about that. So, okay, already by then they knew I was always talking about the hard problem and the easy problems. But I didn't think this was a big deal because everyone knows this is a hard problem. I never thought it's a big contribution to say this is a hard problem. So I didn't think so deeply about what's the best way to phrase it. But I suppose the central phrasing that I've used in my work is, how is it that physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? But there are many different questions which are nearby. There's a broader question, which is just how can you explain subjective experience or give a theory of it, which doesn't necessarily presuppose that it comes from the brain. But of course, it's a very common assumption that it does. And this phrasing it in terms of physical processes in the brain tends to highlight this explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience, which is at the heart of the problem.
But interesting. But what about phrasing, which in one of your early texts you called the deepest part of this problem? Why does consciousness exist at all? And how this phrasing relates to the question, how does the brain give rise to consciousness?
Yeah, well, this is a very deep and difficult question. I suppose one reason why I prefer to phrase it in terms of how do physical processes give rise to subjective experience is that makes it a problem which potentially has a solution. I think the problem, why does consciousness exist at all? To this problem, the answer, if I'm right, may be fairly unsatisfactory. It exists because it is fundamental, because it's a primitive part of the universe. Why does space exist at all? Because it's fundamental. And there the answer stops. But if you phrase the question, why and how do physical processes give rise to subjective experience, you can answer this with a theory of consciousness, a theory of the fundamental laws that connect physical processes to consciousness. And I would like to think that such a theory, in some sense, provides a solution to the hard problem. I think it does that if you conceive of the hard problem in terms of the connection between physical processes and consciousness. But somebody might reasonably say this theory doesn't really answer the question, why does consciousness exist at all? Because these theories presuppose the existence of consciousness as a fundamental property. And then I have to say, that's fair enough. These theories treat consciousness as primitive, like space and time and mass. And the best answer you can give to that question is, it's a fundamental property of the universe.
So it seems that there are two parts of your hard problem. These two questions are rather different. In some sense, it seems even that there is a kind of contradictions between them. Because if consciousness is fundamental, how we can ask at all how our brain can give rise to consciousness, because it doesn't produce if it is fundamental.
I'm not sure about this. Mass, particles with mass can arise from certain interactions where there was nothing there before. We can get mass from energy and so on. So one can still ask specifically, how does this come about? So likewise for consciousness. Consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, but every time there is some new consciousness, like the consciousness I'm having right now, one can ask, what is the explanation for that? And the explanation for that might be in terms of what's going on in my brain and some fundamental laws.
What then do you mean by fundamental property?
Basically,
just like mass, that's the correct answer.
Not further explainable.
Yes.
Having to be taken as primitive. And I think for a naturalist, I consider myself a naturalist, and this means, for me, trying to explain everything in the universe in terms of some small number of fundamental properties and some small number of fundamental laws that govern all of nature. But of course, all explanation has to stop somewhere. And the place where it stops, I think, is the fundamental.
And the last question about the hard problem. What about the relation of the hard problem of consciousness to the mind-body problem? Susan Blackmore asked you this question about 15 years ago, and you responded very interestingly, but maybe your views have changed. So what is the relation between the hard problem and the mind-body problem?
Well, the mind-body problem is many problems. I suppose I've always thought the core of the mind-body problem is the problem of consciousness, the hard problem. When I first started writing about this, actually, as a student in Oxford, I just talked about the mind-body problem as if it was just the problem of consciousness. And I talked about solving the mind-body problem, meaning solving the hard problem. And actually, Kathleen Wilkes, the Oxford philosopher who worked on physicalism, was one of the first to read some of my work on this. And she said, why do you say the mind-body problem when you just mean the problem of consciousness? And I thought this is a fair point. The mind-body problem is very broad in its nature. It might include, for example, the problem of intentionality, because belief and desire and so on, these are parts of the mind, as well as consciousness. It might include the problem of mental causation. How does the mind affect the body? It might include the problem of embodiment. What is it for a body to belong to a particular person? It might include the problem of the unity of the mind, and of, for some people, even problems of free will and personal identity. So the mind-body problem, I see, is a suitcase term for many, many different problems about the mental and its relationship to the physical, whereas the problem of consciousness is something a bit more specific. First, because it's about consciousness, and second, because it's about the explanation of consciousness, especially in terms of physical processes. What did I say 15 years ago?
Quite similar things. You said that it is a core of has a hard problem of consciousness, is a core of mind-body problem, and you mentioned several other problems like a problem of artificial intelligence and mental causation. So your views have really not so much changed.
One of the major contributions that you made to the field is also the focus, or the focus you brought to the zombie argument. So when now philosophers talk about Chalmers, they often think of the philosophical zombie. So how did you come across that argument, and was there any evolution in your definition of the philosophical zombie argument?
It's a good question where it came from in my thinking. I think I first started to think about it at the level of a whole zombie world. I wasn't thinking so much about individual zombies and creatures. It's a whole physical universe, and it just seemed clear to me that you could have a physical universe like this with all the particles laid out throughout space and time without any consciousness at all, a universe devoid of consciousness. Then you focus down onto the individual level, and these creatures are basically like zombies. They're going to be creatures like us, they look like us from the outside without consciousness. Yeah, where did I come across the idea in the literature is interesting. At some point I read the works by Robert Kirk, where he talks about zombies and materialists. I must have read at some point Keith Campbell, where he talks about the Imitation Man in 1970. He was writing about this, and it has very much the idea of a zombie without using the word. And there was also a literature in the 1970s on what they called absent qualia, not so much about physical duplicates without consciousness, but functional duplicates without consciousness. So Ned Block and others talked about this case, and it always seemed to me that if you could make sense of absent qualia functional duplicates without consciousness, you should also do this for physical duplicates. For some reason, this wasn't really a focus of the discussion at that time, but it seemed to me that once you've got one, it's very easy to have the other. So that's where the discussion should be focused. So this thing which was being put forward as a problem for functionalism, I thought, okay, well, this can actually be seen much more broadly as a problem for physicalism. Was there some part of it I didn't answer?
Did did your definition of the argument evolve? I mean, is this like a...
It came to seem to me the best way to formulate this argument, which is very broadly speaking a conceivability argument. Zombies are conceivable, so they're possible. This is a form of argument which, of course, is very familiar in philosophy from Descartes onward. But it always seemed to me that there were problems with Descartes' argument that didn't apply to the zombie argument. When people talked about this, I think they tended to assimilate them and say, these arguments don't show so much, conceivability doesn't prove possibility, especially in light of what we know from Frege puzzle cases, and especially from Kripke. Water and H2O being necessary, although a posteriori. It came to seem to me quite clearly that these cases were not analogous. There's very strong disanalogy which applied to the zombie case and not so much to the other cases. So before long I thought, well, the best way to work this through was to think about this in terms of certain two-dimensional structure of possibilities, and that's when I came to think about the zombie argument through the lens of two-dimensional semantics. And I think once you do that, that provides a nice, relatively straightforward way of analyzing the disanalogies and actually making the case that even if Descartes' arguments and other arguments against materialism don't work, the zombie argument has some chance of working. So I suppose as I came to think about it more and more systematically, which is when I was working on my PhD thesis in the early 1990s, this motivated me to really think very hard about Kripke and naming a necessity and the structure of possible worlds. And once I did that, I thought that really, the zombie argument is intuitive even without getting to that structure, but in light of all the obvious philosophical objections, then I think the structure of two-dimensional semantics was, for me, the technical tool that provided the structure then for analyzing the intuitive basis of the zombie argument.
So the idea of the zombie, the philosophical zombie, allows for several different interpretations of mental causation. So what are, and you have, it seems like you have been going from one view to another. So what is your view currently on the mental causation? What is the preferable view?
I don't have a settled view on mental causation. I've always thought there are about three possibilities. Some people think that the whole zombie idea presupposes epiphenomenalism. Consciousness plays no causal role. John Perry says this, and I've argued against that. I want to protest against that quite strongly. I think the zombie idea is consistent with interactionist dualism. It's also consistent with panpsychism, with consciousness playing a role. It's fair to say that when I wrote The Conscious Mind, although I was somewhat neutral on these questions, many people read it as sympathetic with epiphenomenalism. And at that point, I was probably more sympathetic with epiphenomenalism than I am now. I still consider it a possibility, but I've been very seriously entertaining a couple of ideas. One of them, interactionism, the idea that consciousness may play a role, for example, in directing physical processes, especially perhaps in quantum mechanics, in collapsing the quantum mechanical wave function. In The Conscious Mind, I was quite unsympathetic with this idea, saying, I don't think this really helps. Now I've come to think that what I said there was too quick, and there are some possibilities. So actually, right now, lately, I've been working with an old graduate student of mine who now is working in the philosophy of physics, Kelvin McQueen. He's thought very hard about quantum mechanics, and the two of us are trying to see if we can make this kind of interpretation where consciousness collapses the quantum wave function. Just see if we can first make that idea rigorous, see at least if it's coherent, then eventually might see perhaps if it could be experimentally tested. The other avenue I've been pursuing is the avenue of panpsychism, where consciousness is present in the physical world right at its very basis, and perhaps serves as the basis for all microphysical dispositions. So when one particle affects another particle, it's really consciousness that's doing the work. If that view can be made to work, I think, well, I've put it forward as a kind of a Hegelian solution to this dialectic between the materialist and the dualist. Panpsychism has the best of both worlds by preserving the intuitions of the primitiveness of consciousness, while also giving it a causal role at the fundamental level. The big problem for that view is the combination problem. For panpsychism, how does all this add up, to my mind, to my kind of consciousness? There's been a huge amount of work on this problem, a real explosion over the last 10 years. And I think it's been one of the most interesting things to happen in this field. But still, there's no solution to the combination problem. You know, some days I feel that it's so hard that maybe it can't be solved, in which case I come back to the dualist side. But the fact is, this is a hard problem, and you know, right now we don't know the solution. So I think it's appropriate to be somewhat open as to what the right solution might be.
But do you think that consciousness may play a certain role in the free will?
It's a very good question. I mean, free will means many different things to different people. So one aspect of the free will problem is the question of, does consciousness play a role? And if that's what you mean by the free will problem, then, well, it kind of comes down to the question of mental causation. But if, for example, you mean questions of moral responsibility, I suppose I'm inclined to think that, you know, our moral responsibility that attaches to us as agents attaches to us as conscious agents. If we were zombies probably don't have very much in the way of moral responsibility. If they have any kind, it's a much more deflated kind. You know, maybe they'd still have some, maybe it would still make sense to punish them, at least for deterrence and so on, but whether they could really be seen as responsible for their action and deserving punishment and blame, I don't know. I don't know if conscious agents do either, but I'm inclined to think that conscious agents are really the fundamental loci, both of moral worth, of moral consideration, and of moral responsibility. So there's got to be some connection at that broad level. Whether that means that at the level of every individual action, that for an action to carry moral responsibility and be truly free, it has to be conscious, I'm not sure. I think there are many things that we do automatically, somewhat below the level of consciousness, where it's not, you know, driving my car or performing certain very well practiced actions, where the role of consciousness in those actions is at best unclear. But I think I'd be inclined to say those still carry moral responsibility, because they're still the actions of a conscious agent who's been conscious of all this in the past and thought about this. So it's not obvious to me, though, that there needs to be a direct role of consciousness in the moment for that kind of free will. And it may even be that some acts that are performed unconsciously can carry moral responsibility. So there is a connection between consciousness and free will. It probably, I think, lies at some more basic underlying level, at the structure of a person and their intentions and goals. That said, I mean, there are many of the interesting questions about free will, for example, raised by the work of Libet and the like. Many of them are questions about the causal role of consciousness in action, and those questions are just extremely interesting in their own right.
Mm-hmm. As a continuation of the previous question, I would like to ask, do you have any settled opinions on traditional philosophical problems, such as free will problem, personal identity problem, God's existence, I don't know, limits of our knowledge, and so on?
Oh, those are easy ones. I don't know. Some of these problems are very difficult. Free will, I've talked about a bit. I think there's many notions of free will. I incline towards compatibilism, about moral responsibility, at least. And even if one brings it, I mean, one thing about the problem of free will versus determinism is even once you bring in consciousness, the problem is still there. Even once you bring in a causal role for consciousness, if it's a deterministic role, that problem is still there. So for consciousness to make a difference, it would have to be something non-deterministic. Maybe the quantum mechanics could help with that a little bit, but it's unclear how much it helps. On personal identity, some of these problems are becoming quite salient to me in the guise of thinking about technology, information technology, simulation technology. The problem of personal identity is becoming quite salient as we start to think about the possibility of uploading our brains into computers, a choice that some of us may be faced with sometime in the next 100 years.
That's why I ask this question. But do you have a settled opinion on this?
Not
question?
a settled opinion, no. Personal identity is difficult. I incline towards a psychological view, where what matters is something mental, Right? You know, I think my body could probably change completely. My brain could change completely. So there's something tied to the mental I would privilege. And I'm more confident about sufficient conditions. If, for example, there's continuity of consciousness throughout, then it's fairly plausible there's continuity of the person throughout. So if I am to upload my mind to a computer, I would rather this happen through an operation in which I'm there, staying conscious throughout. And maybe gradually my neurons get the nanotechnology, the nanorobots come in and replace my neurons one at a time with silicon chips. And I'm here paying attention, thinking. So there's one stream of consciousness throughout. Then I'm inclined to think that might be the best I can do in terms of sufficient conditions for survival. This is not yet to give necessary and sufficient conditions. It seems fairly implausible that continuity of consciousness is required for identity, because it seems that most nights we go to sleep and we lose consciousness. We wake up in the morning, and at least I hope that I'm the same person that I was yesterday. So the conditions for continuity of personhood must be somewhat weaker than this, but I don't have a very strong view about what's required, and I'm increasingly inclined towards a somewhat deflationary view where there may be no deep facts of the matter about personal identity over time, although I still feel the tug of very strong intuitions that say there must be facts here. Or God's existence.
Yes.
I've always inclined towards atheism, agnosticism leaning towards atheism, with the thought that we don't have need for this hypothesis. The world is simpler without God, so at least no strong reason to believe God exists, and therefore abductive reasons, at least, to think there may be no God. Lately, I've been getting just a little more sympathetic with the idea through thinking about information technology and through thinking about the possibility that perhaps we live in a computer simulation, such as The Matrix. And Nick Bostrom has this very interesting argument that statistically there seems very likely there may be many simulated universes in the history of the cosmos, many more simulated beings than unsimulated beings. And then you start to think about the odds. What are the odds that I'm one of the few unsimulated beings? It starts to seem more probable that I could be one of the many simulated beings. Of course, this argument requires some premises about consciousness, including the premise that a simulated being would have consciousness like mine. If they didn't, then maybe the issue wouldn't arise. But I think there's at least some prima facie force to this, which would lead us to take seriously at least the hypothesis we're in a simulation. If you do, then the next question is, what does this say about God?
Yes.
Well, suddenly it seems that our universe, this four-dimensional space-time that we are in, appears to have been created, at least in the sense of being programmed by a programmer who ran some program or pressed a button to kick all this off. They're in some sense then our creator. Are they our gods? Well, perhaps they could be all-knowing, omniscient, and all-powerful, omnipotent. Some button they could press could lead to the destruction of our universe just like that. They're our creator. These are some of the properties of the traditional God. At the same time, should this being be all good? Probably not. It could just be some teenage kid in the next universe up, hacking around for fun. I've seen my 5-year-old nephew running Sim Life or something. It sets up a whole city and then destroys it all. It's kind of like the God of the Old Testament when you think about it. It's like fire and floods. So for me, for calling it a God, the question is, should you set up a religion about this being? Is this being worthy of worship? And I don't see any reason to think this being is worthy of worship. So even if we do live in a simulated universe with a creator, I'm inclined not to use the word God for this creature simply because of that dimension of morality and worship, which is lacking in this case. But on the other hand, I think many people should concede that this is one route to at least the possibility of a creator, which suddenly seems somewhat more naturalistic and somewhat less spooky and metaphysical than many of the traditional views. And I think, many people who otherwise consider themselves atheists are actually taking this possibility seriously. Whether this leads then to a whole new religion like simulation theology, well, that remains to be seen.
Very interesting new computer argument for God's existence.
Yeah.
Very interesting. in addition to the traditional arguments. Again, thank you. Very informative response. But, again, as a kind of continuation of the previous question, when discussing philosophical problems, like those problems you have just mentioned, you often say that you have no settled or definite opinion. One day you say you prefer one theory, another day another. My question is, why is it so? Is it connected to the very nature of philosophical problems? Maybe it is in principle impossible to solve them. Am I correct? Why?
The philosophical problems are very difficult. And I think there are some systematic reasons for this. One reason is that once we solve a problem, it's no longer philosophy. Even once we figure out how to make progress on the problem in a really systematic way, it's no longer philosophy. Newton considered himself a philosopher. But and the problems he was dealing with about the nature of space and time were philosophical problems. But he figured out the framework by which one could make systematic, empirical, mathematical progress on the problems. And before long, people separated out a field for dealing with these questions, and they called it physics, not philosophy, still dealing with the same problems. But once you've got a method, then a field splits off. And the same happened to some extent with psychology in the 19th century. It's happened with linguistics and economics and so on. So to some extent, it's by the very nature of philosophy that we deal with the hard problems, the problems which are too hard to have split off their field yet. And it's to be expected. There will be some such problems. When it comes to those problems, I think it's appropriate to have some humility. And so it's appropriate to have views, to work through them as best as you can and to narrow down the space of possible views. But I think one should also concede what we don't know. I'm particularly interested. I've never wanted to be a pessimistic philosopher, even though I've become associated with the ideas that the problem of consciousness is hard to solve. I'm much more interested in coming up with constructive theories, eventually having a science of these things. So that leads me to focus on the possibility of positive theories, but then also in light of an appreciation of the difficulty of those problems. I think that particular combination makes it very natural to say, okay, I would like to have a constructive theory, but we're not yet in a position to solve the problem. So we're really in the position of constraining the options. Here is one avenue that might work. Here is another avenue that might work. So I don't really apologize for not choosing one of these options. Sometimes I find myself exploring these paths in parallel, and certainly as a community, that's what we should be doing. I think it's also appropriate for individuals to commit themselves to a solution just to see how it goes. And then it's good for the community to explore all of these in parallel. But the fact is, when you've got a problem as hard as this, I think it's appropriate to keep many possibilities salient in your mind.
But is there any way to solve such problems? I mean, not by scientific methods, by, say, conceptually. What if, for example, someone will discover a new argument? So I try to understand in which case you will be able at the end to choose, to make a choice, and said, I have a settled opinion.
Yeah. I would like, say for example, for the hard problem of consciousness, I would like to think that eventually we might have some scientific framework, for me a set of fundamental laws that connect physical processes to consciousness. I have to concede that it's possible, though, that some of these disagreements will continue. Even after we have some candidate theories here, maybe there'll be someone, there'll be in the year 2200, will be there, and there will still be the analog of Dan Dennett saying, no, there's just easy problems, there's no hard problem, it's an illusion. And there'll be the analog of me saying consciousness is fundamental, and there'll be the analog of you arguing for interactionist dualism, and so on. I do think the progress of science can help with this. As we get better developed empirical theories, things will be really constrained. Once we have detailed candidate theories of consciousness at the empirical level, finding the correlations between physical processes and consciousness, these will end up putting strong constraints on the form of a philosophical theory. For example, if the best empirical theory of consciousness starts to look panpsychist in its character, that may be extremely suggestive for the underlying metaphysics. Some people have already argued for this in the case of Tononi's integrated information theory. Maybe things will go so that, for example, certain empirical developments suggest that with the collapse of the quantum wave function, only some systems can produce this kind of collapse and other ones cannot. If things go that way, then that might be very suggestive for which systems are conscious and which ones are not. So I think empirical developments can play some role here, and I think argumentative, a priori developments can also play some serious role. Of course, the trouble with armchair developments, I like armchair philosophy, I like a priori philosophy, I think it can be very powerful, but it tends to produce less agreement than empirical science does. When I give an a priori argument that seems very powerful to me, to another philosopher, it's like, that's easy to resist. So just as a matter of fact, it seems to compel less agreement than, I think empirical methods in philosophy are no better for impelling agreement. When people use an empirical argument for a philosophical claim, say about the mind-body problem, then it usually leads to just as much disagreement. So I ended up writing a whole paper about progress in philosophy about this question. And it would be wonderful if there was the golden bullet method that would resolve all philosophical questions. But by their nature, these problems are very difficult problems. We just got to hope that every now and then one of them will cross that bridge from philosophy into something like science, or from intractable to tractable. And we never know when that might happen.
And our next question, just about the progress.
You wrote in, I think in 2014, just recently, you wrote a paper on the progress in philosophy. Yeah. And in that paper you state that the progress in philosophy is possible, but though it is not as substantial or is not as fast as in the hard science. So please explain. So what do you consider a progress in philosophy? For instance, is this kind of a convergence of the views, or is this the elimination of some bad and wrong, arguments and views, or is this the creation of new arguments and the introduction of the new thesis? What is the progress?
Well, I think there are lots of forms of progress in philosophy, and I certainly don't want to claim that there is no progress in philosophy, but I think the progress often takes certain specific forms. So, for example, one thing philosophy is great at is exploring new views and new possibilities, new areas of philosophical space. Here is a space to look for thinking about the mind-body problem. How about Russellian monism? Or how about some new super-duper illusionism or functionalism or something? So we come up with new possibilities all the time. I think we get understanding of arguments for conclusions. We come to understand better what are the best reasons for holding a view and the best reasons for rejecting it. Every now and then we make negative progress in the sense of ruling out certain views, or at least of refining the versions of views that have the most promise. Still, there's a form of progress which I think I'm especially interested in, which is slower, and that's arriving at collective knowledge of the solutions to philosophical problems, not just the reasons for one view, not just what the views are, not just what the reasons are, not just ruling out a couple, but coming to know which positive view is correct. For me, this is actually why I got into philosophy, to understand, why is there consciousness? What is the solution to the mind-body problem? Likewise for other problems, free will, personal identity. I think we have to concede that, at least as a matter of sociological fact, it looks like progress of that kind is slower in philosophy. And the reason is there's not so much convergence to any particular view in philosophy. Over time, it seems the sciences tend to converge. Certainly physics tends to converge, relativity, quantum mechanics, and so on. For the most part, we don't see that kind of positive convergence in philosophy. And for that reason, it's hard to say that there's collective knowledge of solutions to these problems, at least right now. I think that's consistent with there being a whole lot of progress and increased sophistication, even increased knowledge of many of the questions that come up along the way as I've been saying, but for this central key question of knowledge of the solutions to the big questions, I think, well, these questions are hard and progress really is quite slow. We can still hope, again, eventually, one of these problems, every now and then, one of these problems gets solved, and then, or at least we come up with practical methods for breaking down certain forms of resistance, and then that's when a new field gets split off. So maybe something like that is beginning to happen with some aspects of the problem of consciousness, as the new science of consciousness is really getting off the ground. I mean, it has to be said that when it comes to the really deepest questions, like the hard problem of consciousness, the science of consciousness has not yet produced any amazing breakthroughs there, but at least we're developing theories, all of which I think are the kind which may well end up strongly informing the philosophy.
Your question
Mm-hmm. So given that understanding of the progress in philosophy, where do you think now the biggest potential for those kinds of solutions are?
In which areas?
In which areas? Yeah.
Philosophy.
For what? For philosophy in general? Which
Philosophy.
areas
Which
of philosophy?
areas of philosophy has most potential for
to get those
problems
resolutions?
solved?
Yeah.
The ones with easy problems.
Yes.
It's a good question. I think in some areas of philosophy, my attitude is to deflate the problems a little bit and argue the problems are not quite as deep as they may seem. For example, there are some verbal disputes in some of these cases. Sometimes I think the problem of free will may involve some element of this, as Hume did, of course. I think some debates in the philosophy of language may also have this character. People argue about what is the correct analysis of meaning. I'm inclined to think there are many different kinds of meaning, and we shouldn't be arguing about what the meaning is, but different notions of meaning to be analyzed in different ways. So I'm inclined, I think some of the problems in philosophy of language are becoming problems in the science of semantics and might be deflatable. For the really, for the really hard questions, the problem of consciousness, the problem of how do we know about the external world, the problem of what is the right thing to do, and what's the source of that. I think, the solution's not going to be as easy as that. But, I think in all these cases, there are at least new ways of shedding light on the problem. I've been lately interested in the problem of the external world through the lens of information technology and thinking about simulations. And so I think maybe this can shed some new light on the problem. Is the problem going to be resolved anytime soon? Probably not. Is the hard problem of consciousness going to be resolved anytime soon? No, probably not. But at least in the meantime, we can make these kinds of progress where we illuminate the problem and come to understand it better. But for the really hard problems in philosophy, I think we should expect progress to be measured at the level of centuries rather than at the level of years.
But what about the progress of your own views?
Oh, of
in
course.
which
Well, that's
direction
different.
you develop
Completely
them
different.
and why?
Oh,
You told something about this, but maybe
in the past or in the future?
now in
What
the
am I
present.
now thinking about? Lately, I've been thinking a lot about technology and about philosophical issues approached through the light of technology. I've talked a bit already about, for example, the idea that we're living in a computer simulation and how this transforms some ideas in the philosophy of religion. I think it can also really shed some light on some of the traditional problems of skepticism in epistemology and maybe even some issues in metaphysics. One project I have right now is to write a book all about the big problems of philosophy approached through the lens of technology, basically reframing many of these problems through a technological lens and then approaching epistemology and metaphysics and the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of value and the philosophy of language and the philosophy of science, all through the lens of this technology, partly through thinking about real, virtual reality technology, such as the headsets, which are now coming into widespread use, and partly through these ideas that everything might be a computer simulation, partly through the ideas of artificial intelligence and mind uploading. And so I think these questions are actually becoming very pressing for us as technology becomes more and more ubiquitous in our lives, and many of the questions it raises are philosophical. So there's both, I think, some practical benefit to be gotten through reflecting on technology. But I also think, and what I'm ultimately interested in, is to see if thinking about philosophy through this lens might provide at least a new angle for illuminating these problems. So I'd like to write a book doing all this for a very broad audience, but which is at the same time a substantial work of philosophy. And I mean, the central part of it will be a certain line on the solution to the skeptical problems, along the lines of what I once laid out in a paper, The Matrix as Metaphysics, but now developed at much more length. So I'm hoping that at the same time this could be a broad introduction to philosophy for a very wide audience and a substantial work of philosophy in its own right, but we'll see.
Yeah. So you wrote a very interesting paper on the subject called the Singularity.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you also have an exchange with Dan Dennett. He published a response to you. So as you state, Singularity is actually an anticipated intelligence explosion, which could be led by machines creating yet more complicated, more intelligent machines. So can you explain the singularity further and tell us whether you indeed think it's a possible scenario, and when is it going to be possible? I know you have some kind of even like estimations on when that's possible to happen.
Yeah, so this is an idea that goes back at least to the statistician and philosopher I.J. Good, if not further. It's an idea about what happens when machines become smarter, more intelligent, and more capable than human beings. And the rough idea is that at some point, machines will become as intelligent as humans. Shortly after that, they'll become a bit more intelligent than humans, at which point they'll be more capable than humans at many things, including the programming of machines. So once machines are better programmers than humans, they'll be able to program machines that are more capable than the most capable machines the humans can program, and therefore they'll be able to create machines which are more intelligent than themselves. Repeat this process, those machines will be able to create machines which are more intelligent still. Repeat the process again, repeat. You get a rapid spiral to superintelligence. Some people call this the intelligence explosion, or simply the singularity. It's a point at which intelligence goes rapidly to infinity, or at least to large unbounded realms, and where what happens becomes impossible to predict. Now, although this idea sounds like science fiction and to many people sounds far too speculative, I think there's actually a very interesting philosophical argument behind it, embodied in that little recursive argument summary I just gave. So a few years ago I decided to analyze this argument, and I just tried to write it down in rigorous form with premises and a conclusion to see, well, if this argument goes wrong, where does it go wrong? And of course, like all arguments in philosophy, there are places where you can question it. But I think the argument actually looks surprisingly good. There's only a certain limited number of ways in which this could fail to happen. Maybe, for example, artificial intelligence is impossible. You can't even simulate a human brain computationally. Or maybe at a certain point, people will choose not to create artificial intelligence, or the artificial intelligences will choose not to create this process. Or maybe at certain points, there'll be diminishing returns. Yeah, these are all possibilities, but I do think it means this singularity is an idea we should take seriously. I think that's interesting both philosophically for thinking about intelligence and the mind, also very important for thinking about practically. If this is going to happen, then it suggests that the creation of artificial intelligence will be one of the most important things that ever happens in the universe, that will dictate the course of everything that happens after that. We want to make sure that what happens, when that happens, it happens in a way which is good for the universe and for humanity, and not in a way which is bad for the universe and humanity. So I've been quite interested in those questions lately. In October, we're having a conference on the ethics of artificial intelligence at New York University, bringing together AI researchers, philosophers of mind, ethicists, and others, just to reflect on these questions, because I think these are very important philosophical and practical questions going forward.
So, in talking about ethics, I think you have a certain solution or a certain proposal how to deal with the artificial intelligence. So you stipulate that in order to prevent the potential harm, the harmful events, we need to create artificial intelligence in the virtual reality environment. And something I also noted that was really interesting is that you suggest that if we do create those agents, the artificial agents, in those virtual reality worlds, they're likely to become Cartesian dualists. So can you explain this a little bit more? Why do we need to put them in the virtual reality world? And why would they become Cartesian dualists?
Well, certainly one possibility for creating AI is to do it in a simulated world, in a virtual reality. One reason we might do that is to try as a means of protection. Okay, well, if they're there, they'll be locked in, they won't be able to get out. No, I think there are limitations to how successful that's likely to be. If we really create super intelligence inside a simulated world, if those beings are having any communication with us, if we're talking, for example, I'd be surprised if they didn't find a way to use their super intelligence to convince us to let them out. Maybe, for example, they'd show us all the wonderful things they could do for us, and we'd rapidly become convinced that, okay, we have to do this for the goodness of the world. So I don't know how good it is. I mean, it's a useful initial step, perhaps, in creating AI, to do it in virtual worlds. It may not be a bulletproof solution to the problem of safe artificial intelligence, but it does raise some interesting questions about what the universe would seem like to an AI creature in a virtual world. I mean, there's many different ways you could embed AI in a virtual world. Its brain could itself be part of the virtual world. There could be a physics of that world and a physics that produces its brain. But another way it could work, and this is how most AI in virtual worlds works right now, is there's one set of algorithms for the physics that governs the dynamics of the objects that the AI is interacting with, blocks and creatures, and usually a very simple physics with one program to govern that. And there's another quite separate algorithm for the AI agent. And that algorithm is not governed by the physics of the world at all. It's just a separate set of rules, or maybe it's a neural network or some other algorithm. And these are quite distinct in the implementing machine. And there's the physics of their environment is one thing, and the dynamics of their cognitive processing is quite another. So you can imagine an AI creature growing up in this world and getting sophisticated enough to investigate it and figuring out the physics of their external reality such as it is, and then looking at themselves and saying, well, how can I model myself this way? And maybe having great difficulty. They'd probably even open up their heads, and I presume they wouldn't find brains. They just find it's just more skull or something. The algorithms, the rules are something else. So it's quite natural to suppose they would then become dualists, Cartesian dualists, saying here's the physical world, here's my body, my mind is somewhere else. And they'd be right. Their mind really would be somewhere else. And maybe they could eventually start inferring the principles by which their mind works, quite different from the principles by which the physics works. I suppose they could ultimately, and they'd say, well, how could the goings on in my mind affect the physical world? Well, we know the answer to that. Of course, in the underlying realm, there's a giant computer that includes all of this, where it's all connected up. But from their perspective, the right thing to say might be that some kind of Cartesian dualism is true. I find this at least instructive in various ways. Many philosophers have suggested that Cartesian dualism is somehow incoherent. Well, here is a way that something, at least much like Cartesian dualism, seems perfectly coherent and even naturalistic from the right perspective. Of course, you could say that underneath this Cartesian dualism is an underlying materialism, let's say, in the next universe up. It's all a big physical process on a computer in the next universe up. This, I think, teaches us the lesson that we should always be open to underlying monisms. Whatever dualism we have, maybe there's a neutral monism, some substance, some unification underlying all this at a grander level that brings it all together, which may be somehow something that we are not yet, from our limited perspective, in a position to appreciate.
But what would be the likely outcome of the singularity for humans? You spoke about the uploading of ourselves to the machines. So what do you think? If we indeed envision this kind of outcome, and we would need to upload ourselves to the to the machines, upload our consciousness and personal, what would, and personal identity. Is this possible? How would we preserve consciousness? Would we preserve personal identity? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, if there is artificial intelligence, and if at some point the machines do go to a greater than human level, the question then is, what happens to us? Do we just want to sit back at our old level while these machines vastly outstrip us? I suspect we're not going to want this. I think, if there's going to be super intelligence around, I think we would like to be part of the super intelligence, which then raises the question, well, biological hardware is probably going to soon, maybe there are various ways to upgrade it, but biology is probably going to be inherently slow and fragile and limited in lifespan and so on. So at some point, we're probably going to have to find some way to upload onto different hardware, maybe silicon hardware or maybe some future version, in order just to keep up. And then, so we're going to be faced with the choice of uploading ourselves, and this question of, can we upload our brains? Once we can upload our brains and ourselves onto machines, then maybe those machines could then be augmented, they could be sped up, we could get new modules for all kinds of things, and then rapidly we could be the super intelligent beings. Or another way this could all happen is that the way artificial intelligence first gets created is by uploading us. Maybe if it turns out that neuroscience is easier than AI, then we'll simulate a brain, we'll have a simulated brain, then that will be the first AI. I suspect this won't happen fast. Even after we map the whole brain, it's still a lot more work to simulate it. Right now, we've mapped the 302 neurons in C. elegans, the worm, and still no one can turn that into a working simulation. So that's hard, but it might eventually happen. If that happens, then that's a route to AI. But then we're going to be faced with the question, every individual will be faced with the question, should I upload myself? And if so, what will happen? And there's a couple of big philosophical questions here. One is, will the upload be conscious at all? That's a question about consciousness. And second, if the upload is conscious, will it be me? And that's a question about personal identity. And I suspect that different people are going to come to different answers and different views on this question. I'm no doubt there are going to be some people who hold out and say never upload because it's a form of death. Don't do it. You'll be dying or you'll be turning into a zombie, and all these uploaded creatures are zombies. So it's a philosophical question. I lean towards the view that at least an uploaded creature can be conscious, that the substrate, the biological substrate, is not essential to consciousness. The question of identity is tricky. If someone creates an upload of me with the old original still here, it's hard not to get the intuition there's something privileged about the original. If, on the other hand, you gradually upload my brain, replacing chips one at a time, then it's much easier to come to the view that the uploaded creature will still be me at the end. So maybe the best version is something I mentioned earlier, staying conscious throughout while your brain is gradually uploaded and you're there throughout. And maybe at the end, especially if one has not just physical uncertainty about what will happen, one has philosophical uncertainty about what is the right philosophical view to take of this matter. So if you ask me, what is the path that maximizes the chance of my continuing to exist, even given my philosophical uncertainty, so that, for example, on many different views, I'll continue to exist, I would go for the gradual uploading with preservation of consciousness. Then I upload myself to a machine. Then once I'm there, then I can do all the rest of cognitive augmentation and enhancing and speeding up and so on. Of course, if I'm wrong about all this and John Searle is right, I'll be a zombie and I won't even know the difference.
And maybe our last questions. What is philosophy for you? Is it a theoretical activity only, or also a way of living, so that to say?
To be honest, I'd say it's more of a, for me, philosophy is a route to understanding. I came into philosophy and into science wanting to understand the world, and science is all about understanding the world, understanding the universe, how everything fits together, boiling it down to simple principles, really just seeing how, how the world is and how it all fits and how it's all explained. And philosophy and science are continuous there for me. Practical questions about how to live my life. I mean, I think about that philosophically as well, and there are many philosophical issues about how to live one's life. But much of the philosophy I do doesn't have a direct impact on how I live my life. I'd be hard-pressed to find a direct consequence of two-dimensional semantics for my day-to-day mode of living. For consciousness and so on, it's a little bit closer to home. We're all conscious. We study our own consciousness, and other people are conscious. It's very central to how we think about other people morally, that we think about them as conscious agents. So, for a while, I used to think, for example, maybe I should not eat anything which is conscious, because then I'm somehow destroying a conscious agent, which seems immoral. Of course, once one becomes sympathetic with panpsychism, that becomes a more complex matter. So there are intersections there, but I'd say, for the most part, though, what drives me in philosophy is not questions about ways of life or how I should live my life, although those are important questions too. It's rather the theoretical enterprise of trying to understand the world. And for some questions, like the problem of consciousness, I think right now philosophy perhaps offers the possibility of the most enlightenment for coming to a grand overview and some at least partial understanding of these matters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was a pleasure.